Hello and welcome to Maiden, Matriarch with me, Louise Perry. My guest today is Malcolm Collins, who, with his wife Simone, who was a guest on MMM last year, runs the Collins Institute, which is a pronatalist campaigning organisation. We spoke today about religion, why so many religions are haemorrhaging adherents, what elements a religion needs in order to endure long term, in order to encourage fertility, and Malcolm and Simone's own efforts to design a religion for their family which captures all of these elements. In the extended version of the episode, we also spoke about reproductive technologies, religions that reject or embrace reproductive technologies, particularly IVF, and what the future holds in terms of hedonistic entertainment tech, the dangers of this kind of very tempting hedonism, and how people can protect their children from those dangers. That extended version of the episode is available at louiseperry.substack.com, where, as always, you can also find the back catalogue of extended episodes, the bonus episodes I do with my husband, and the MMM chat community. Enjoy. Malcolm, I wonder if we could start by talking about religion. I mean, I know it's a big topic, right? And it's something you're very interested in.
I would love to. It is one of my favorite topics because I think that it is both sort of downstream from the secularization of society are a lot of some of societal's major ills these days.
Yes.
Whether you are talking about the fertility crash or the mental health crisis, which I think is often undersold, the role that just removing this entire set of sort of mental hygiene traditions that had become accumulated by these various religious systems over time, we just tore all that out. We're like, why is this fence here? And somebody's like, I don't know. Like, why are we doing these arbitrary self-denial rituals? I don't know. Let's throw them out, because you see these in every religious tradition, whether it's Ramadan or Lent or Feast of the Firstborn, and as society secularized, we just do not self-deny anything. Indulge in every single emotion the moment it comes to you. And in fact, anyone who tells you not to, anyone who tells you shouldn't do something that, you have some predilection to do or that generates some form of happiness or arousal in you, they are phobic. And they should be hated. Which is so weird that we think that this wouldn't have consequences on mental health. Anyway, continue. Sorry.
One of the things you do in your most recent book is you deconstruct the elements of religion that produce a healthy society and produce a fertile society in particular. You've mentioned fasting and other kind of self-denial rites already. But what you and Simone are doing in your family life is you are kind of reinventing from the ground up an effective religion, but you haven't just chosen. I mean, talk me through this. You haven't just chosen a religion and pursued the traditional form of it. You are doing something much more 101.
So it's very interesting, and our thoughts have evolved since we wrote the book. And it's something that we've gone into in our travel channel with the Tract series, which we're going to restart again. It's on pause right now. But in our book, the idea was, well, we looked to a lot of the traditional systems, and we didn't see them as necessarily being effective at like the social goods that they used to offer within a modern social context. So if I'm going to word this a bit differently, sometimes I go to my religious friends and I can see that, they do have higher levels of mental health and everything like that. But you look at the deconversion rates intergenerationally right now, and they have fallen off a cliff within Gen Alpha. It is one of those things where a lot of people where they assume society is moving linearly, like how progressive schools are. And it's like, no, it's not linear. It's asymptotic at this point. Like, it's insane. And these systems, it's very much like I almost feel like the colonists have just landed and I'm in Africa, and the last 3 waves have just run over the hill with a spear and been mowed down by a Gatling gun. And, I'm telling my friend, I'm like, I don't think these spears are going to work, because these religious traditions evolved and are optimized for not just like a pre-AI and pre-internet environment, but a pre-industrial environment. Is it any wonder that the forces arrayed against them that are utilizing incredibly advanced mimetic and social techniques, and that control most of the power centers in our society, are beating them back really successfully. And so one of the things we encourage within our book is understanding how they are intergenerationally deconverting people and adapting your religion to better guard against that, like be really intentional about this. And then if you're somebody coming into this from like a secularist perspective, like me, my family deconverted from religion a generation ago. So I was raised an atheist, so coming back to this, I was sort of like, well, I'll approach this from a first principles perspective and attempt to construct something. Since writing the book, the big change in my thought has been actually, I really want to draw stronger connections in the system I'm building for my kids to the Judeo-Christian, Abrahamic traditional tree of religions, and better draw connections into that. And another thing that's really changed since writing the book is I have developed a new sort of world system for categorizing religions, where I really think there's only 3 meaningful religious systems in the world, and most religions end up falling into one of these 3 systems. And one of them I see as being incredibly toxic and dangerous, and perhaps even more toxic and dangerous than progressivism. So if you want me to go on this tangent, I can, or I can go on some other tangent.
No, that's tantalizing. What are the 3, and which is the really dangerous one?
Okay, so polytheism is characterized by elaborate Gestalt stories explaining natural phenomenon, intricate, complicated cosmologies filled with layers and interacting parts, an entire zoo of supernatural forces that often has an internal caste system and roles, divine entities that combine animal and human features or have extra body parts that represent places or things in our world, or that's body parts do, and stories about how these entities interacted in history, divine entities that interact with man, making deals and having conversations. They include either reincarnation after death, afterlives where people fade away, or afterlives where people repeat something they did in life, lean heavily on magical thinking like numerology and sympathetic magic. These are gods that you look at, you can talk to, and you can have sex with. The core value of these systems is duty. The second of the 3 systems, and something I should notice about this categorization system, is that most religions, you can fall into any one of these 3 overarching religions within pretty much any religious faith. So by that, what I mean is you can be a Catholic and worship as if you are a polytheist. This would be like you believe in a total like divine comedy style cosmology that's incredibly intricate with interacting parts. You worship through saints. So you're basically worshiping through a large intricate pantheon. You believe in, a Satan that in some way can realistically resist God's will and is therefore like an alternate deity. I often talk to people and they're like, no, believing in a Satan that can resist God's will is not polytheistic because he has less power than God. And I'm like, in almost all polytheistic pantheons, one deity has less power. Where they're like, oh, well, God created him. And I'm like, in a lot of polytheistic pantheons, there is one God that created the others. So that's the polytheistic one. Polytheism just isn't that common in the world today, but you will see it when you study a lot of world religions where they just feel very, very similar to each other. And you can also see it in some like early Jewish texts and stuff like that feel very polytheistic in the way they're written.
And Hinduism is in that category, no?
Yeah, Hinduism would fall into this category.
Yeah.
The next category is mysticism. So this category is characterized by systems that believe there to be some supernatural or ultra-natural phenomenon behind the fabric of reality, or that is the fabric of reality, which connects all things. This phenomenon is identified as God. God is essentially a sentient medium or substrate. The belief that the goal of humanity is to reconnect with this ultra reality thing behind the nature of reality. At this point, reality as we understand it either ends or merges with that thing. The belief that the divine can be contacted or otherwise interacted with by pushing all thoughts from one's mind or by thinking about it. Practices that involve actions and rituals like chanting, spinning, narcotics, taking odd poses, and sleep deprivation, which are called altered states of consciousness. The belief that experiences had in altered states of consciousness contain more information about the true nature of reality rather than less. The belief that reality does not exist as we perceive it and is in part an illusion. The belief that emotional states hold some intrinsic supernatural value, e.g. God is love, and the elevation of emotional states over logic. Self-indulgent asceticism. After he dies, a man's soul is subsumed by or rejoins the ultra reality or thing behind reality. This is a divine that, when you look at it, represents a cognition you and all reality are an aspect of. The core value of these systems is harmony. And then the final one is monotheism, a distinct God which is totally ineffable to the human mind and which has sovereignty over us. Attempting to know this God or worship him through an earthly intermediary is a sin, idolatry. God that interacts with man through logic, rules, and order. Logic is always considered superior to emotions as a tool for determining the will of the divine within these systems. After he dies, man faces consequences for his actions on earth for all eternity. A prohibition against engaging in supernatural arts, attempting to take shortcuts to God, and the belief that reason is the only path to God. A belief that man has fallen and is wretched in contrast to our potentiality, as well as a commandment to work to expand that potentiality through self-discipline, mental order, austerity, and personal industry. To be happy with yourself is a sin, as you are. To be happy with yourself as you are is a sin. This is a God that if you look at it, you die. It is much greater than man can aspire to interact with, and to attempt to directly is beyond foolish. The core value of these systems is the expansion of human potential. And since writing the book, I have sort of begun to see mystical systems as being almost as dangerous as the sort of progressive secular system, and they are spreading within the various monotheistic religions really quickly right now. For example, the Christian nationalists recently, like the head Christian nationalist, Mike whatever, he gave a prayer that turned out it was from the Theosophical Society. Now, I don't know if you know who the Theosophical Society is,
Is
but
that
that
Rudolf
is a
Steiner?
mystical tradition. Yeah.
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 Explain it briefly for anyone listening who isn't familiar with it. I'm only slightly familiar with
Cool.
it.
So this is where like the swastika came from and stuff like that. They're trying to sort of synthesize all of the various religious traditions in the world into like a single super tradition. And to be like all of the various traditions contain an element of truth. Let's see if we can synchronize them in a way. And they practice magic, they worship external deities, etc. But you also see this within, like, for example, within Judaism, the Hasidic movement is largely a mystic movement, and is very different from I think when you look at historic forms of Judaism, you know, a thousand years ago or something like that, which was much more of a monotheistic tradition. And within Islam, you have the Sufi movement, which is a mystic movement, which is growing and eating more and more of the intellectual caste of Islam. And I actually think that that is what caused the collapse of the Muslim intellectual empire, was the accidental elevation of the Sufi mystical community far earlier than it was elevated within the Christian and Jewish traditions.
The Sufi tradition is not associated with the really aggressive Islamist side of Islam, right? Isn't it relatively benign?
Well, no. So this is why these systems are so dangerous, right? So in my head, in the past, right, like I'm sort of categorizing the world's traditions, and there's like the ultra aggressive Islamists, but there's iterations of this that have co-evolved in some religious Christian traditions, etc. Like it's a strategy for maintaining high birth rates, in which an individual sort of eschews technology. They engage in practices that lower their economic productivity. And typically in the developed world, the lower your economic wealth, the more kids you have. So it increases their fertility rate. And then they adapt an extreme amount of xenophobia, which prevents them from losing children intergenerationally, because they just don't engage with information sources outside of their community as like fully human. But of course, this leads to the side effect, like it does protect their fertility rates, but it leads to the side effect that they become incredibly aggressive to their neighbors and stuff like that. And so this is one tradition that does scare me to some extent. But it's not like I'm worried about my kids deconverting to extremist Islam. Like that's just not like, I think
Yes.
within any tradition that I would build for them a risk. The reason why I view the mystic tradition as such a risk is because it sucks the potentiality out of the societies it contacts. So if you're familiar with like the history of Islam, you know, they were such a golden gleaming empire at one point that when people in France would write books on math, they would make up Arab sounding names for themselves as pseudonyms, because nobody would read any math or science book that wasn't written by a Muslim. They were just considered junk. They underwent a total civilizational collapse, and that collapse wasn't really predicated by an ultra-Islamist form of Islam. It was predicated by the intellectual classes turning to a mystical interpretation of Islam, which led to the collapse, because when you turn to these mystical interpretations, you begin to believe that emotional states are a higher form of truth than like investigatable reality, which is also what you're seeing. Like the far progressive movement isn't really a secular movement. It's a religious cult, really, which is a mystic cult. They believe that emotional states are the thing of like core value in the universe, and that to impede a person's emotional state is a form of violence against that individual. And so this sort of like information or sort of like religious package, which like re-evolves over and over again throughout history, is particularly dangerous because unlike the, say, Islamist iteration, it targets the best and brightest of a society and saps them of their potentiality. So if you look at like America, of like our great industrialists, a recent one who was really sapped by this was Steve Jobs, right? Like he fell fully into this, really did no meaningful charity work, ended up dying because of like, well, he thought the information that he gleaned from corrupted mental states, i.e. on narcotics, on drug trips and stuff like that, was of higher order than information gained by science and logic. So I think we can see it through him how this can lead to the downfall of an individual and how it leads to inefficacious action in the world.
Was it Buddhism that Steve Jobs embraced, or something else?
He embraced one of these mindsets that like all religions have an element of truth, I believe.
Oh, okay. Some novel.
But it might have been some Buddhism as well. I think it wasn't like a traditional hard form of Buddhism. It was one of these really loosey-goosey, Americanized forms of Buddhism.
Right. It's worth an expression of yours, which I think is very useful, is this concept of hard cultures. If you want to explain that for a second. So hard cultures do tend to be more fertile, right? But they come with their own costs.
Cultures can be thought of as existing on a spectrum from hard to soft. Cultures usually start hard and they become softer the longer they are around. Hard cultures are characterized by distinct forms of practices that other members. So typically they will dress in a way that others them in society. They will speak in a way that others them in society. They might even have a totally different language or like sub-language. And they do not compromise typically on the original commandment sort of structures of their religious tradition. And when you see cultures like that, you see them like Mormons are like a medium soft culture, whereas often cults are the hardest of cultures because a cult is generally the word we use for a totally new religion. But you look at other things like Jehovah's Witnesses would be a very hard culture. Hasidic Jews, specifically the Haredi variety, would be a very hard culture. So you see these throughout society. Soft cultures go in the complete opposite direction. I think many people think that if you drain sort of the ocean of religion, what you find underneath is secularism. And that's just not true. When you drain the ocean of religion, there's almost sort of like a pre-coded religion into like the fabric of the human mind that I almost liken to like when a cart goes along a path that a bunch of other carts have gone on in the past, it gets sort of caught into it. And, it is characterized often by assigning like magical power to like fetishes. So you'll have like lucky tokens and something like that. Categorizing people becomes really common in these, like zodiac signs or like blood categorizations. It becomes really common in these to have like some forms of magical thinking, like some things in reality are meant to like signal things to you, and you ascribe the world some form of a theory of mind basically to it. And then there's systems in between these, and some religions have come up with really powerful ways to prevent this despite their antiquity. So like Catholicism is one that we note here, where what Catholicism does to prevent it from becoming soft as quickly as it otherwise might is create orders which act like totally new, like ultra fervent religious sects. And anyone who's familiar with the history of the Catholic orders knows that they typically start really like extremist and then over time become more and more wealthy, more and more indolent, and more sort of out of favor with the church until they restart. But what the orders allow for is Catholicism to essentially take sort of offshoots, almost like skunkwork startup projects within like a massive company, and then take people who are developed and educated within those and re-inject them back into the heart, sort of like the stem line of the church, to keep the church from drifting too much. But anyway, yeah.
So like a self-regenerative system within the faith that never actually abandons the faith.
Yeah. And Judaism also has some really interesting systems to deal with this as well. But I don't want to go too far on a tangent here.
I mean, going back to this question about your family religion, are you and Simone not tempted to just try and join a hard religion?
No, I don't think that there are any good ones right now. Like when I say there's no good ones, what I could mean is like the goal of the religious system we're creating for our family is to be or help ensure that our kids are among the faction of humanity that ends up colonizing the stars and ends up mattering on like a galactic timescale. One of the things that's really interesting is people will ask me, they're like, well, who do you think is having too many kids? You know, it's part of the pronatalist movement. Like, aren't you concerned about this convergent tradition, the one I mentioned before that you find out of like technophobia, xenophobia, and economic unproductivity, that this is leading to really high fertility rates? And it's like, not particularly, because as time goes on, the groups that engage with technology have disproportionately more power vis-a-vis the groups that don't. And I'm not really afraid of my distant descendants being attacked by people with like clubs and AKs if they have like AI powered drones with guns on them. You know, like it's not a particular threat to them. The bigger threat to my kids is they get sucked into one of these new evolved cults, which, you know, we argue you see in things like parts of the trans movement, parts of what has become like modern psychology, or they get sucked in by one of these groups that specializes in targeting, you know, highly pro-social, intelligent individuals, you know, like parts of the progressive movement or some like mystic groups. And so that's the biggest risk to my kids. And so that's why when I look at the various religious traditions, I just don't see them as having good defenses against them. Like even the ones that I love, like Judaism, right? Like my wife is matrilineally Jewish. We could go the Jewish pathway, but when I look to the Jewish community, I see them as having had very poor defenses against the growth of mysticism over the past 500 or so years. And I wouldn't want to, you know, send my kids into that particular bonfire. Mormonism, I think, is a strong contender. I really like a lot of the Mormon systems, but if you look at the Mormon deconversion rates right now, they're absolutely out of control. And their own fertility rate has absolutely crashed. And I don't particularly like the governing system that they use. I think it's pretty poorly designed. And so when I'm considering like the alternatives, like I'm considering my kids' future and sending them into a world where if they don't have some sort of like core moral framework and like a reason that they understand for that moral framework and like a cultural synthesis, I think one of the big problems that people make is they send their kids out into the world and they say, oh, we're just secular. You know, and the kids are like, oh, I'm secular, right? And so then a group comes along and says, you know, any guy can become a woman now. The scientists say that, and the scientists are like the priest caste of the secular world. And so you don't have a defense against this. And so it's very easy for them to be pulled out because then they say, and by the way, anyone who questions this is a bigot. So just be aware that you need to like silence them, and anyone who reads stuff that's written by bigots is a bigot. Like it's a very effective system. It's sort of preventing these individuals from interacting with outsiders. And so, you know, I see this and I'm like, okay, so the secular path doesn't work. But the older religious systems, and I should talk about why the older religious systems are failing so hard right now. So this, what I'm going to describe is true for pretty much all of them, but Judaism, which is failing for a totally other reason. It's typically that they used to exist predominantly in environments where almost everyone in that environment was of the same religious tradition. So if I was a Mormon and I was sending my kids to a local high school, the high school would be broadly Mormon. If I was a Christian in Texas and I was sending my kids to a local high school, the high school would be broadly Christian. If the kids started to deconvert, the teachers would come and tell me. When I was a kid, my family got told all the time, "Do you know he's not Christian? Do you know he's not Christian?" Like this is even when I was a kid, right? And a lot of the systems they had, like we will punish you if you deconvert, right? Or you do things that are against our religion, are very effective when you have that sort of secret police working out for you. They have the exact opposite effect when the school systems themselves are now the pathway out of the religious tradition and are hiding from the parents that their kids have changed their belief system. So I'll often talk to people in these more traditional systems today, and they'll be like, "Oh, my kid knows better than to like deconvert or move away from our Christian heritage." And I'm like, "What you just told me is that if they were deconverting, they wouldn't tell you." And this is something I see a lot when I talk with Gen Alpha, is they have deconverted and their parents just don't know. And they're just waiting until they're free, which I think is why we're seeing these really high rates.
Have they gone to mainstream schools? So they haven't been, because presumably if you're in Utah, you could still go to a properly Mormon school where this was less of a risk.
There are very few religious systems. So you look at like Catholic schools, pretty much the entire Catholic school system has been taken over by the wokes. If you are sending your kids to Catholic school, unless it's like a very specific, like extremist one, you're basically sending them on a pathway out of the religion. Within Mormonism, I assume there's probably some schools, but they appear to be like they are, like if I'm joining a team right now, like suppose we're in a world and like every religion or cultural tradition represents an army that has like a specific population that is either pushing outwards or contracting. They are losing right now. This is like joining, the Axis powers in World War I when they are very clearly losing the war. Like I don't, that just seems like a losing bet to me, but also it doesn't make logical sense to me. Like I look at their traditions and they just don't logically convince me. And I don't want to go into why they don't logically convince me, because that can be seen as a bit of a personal attack on people. But when I created a system for my family, the core thing I wanted was, to somebody that is incredibly skeptical and incredibly scientifically minded, the system could at least be plausible. And that the second thing that wasn't as true when I was writing the Pragmatist Guide to Crafting Religion, but now is very true and important to me, that it also could be seen as a continuation of the Judeo-Christian tradition.
This episode is brought to you by Cozy Earth, the source for all of your bedding, bath and loungewear needs. Cozy Earth sell all sorts of products: duvets, temperature regulated sheets, towels, men's and women's clothes of all kinds, PJs, knitwear, socks, sweatshirts, super high quality, really luxurious, fantastic source of wedding gifts. My husband has one of their bamboo quarter zip sweatshirts described as ultra soft. It really is ultra soft. He's one of the fussiest people I've ever come across when it comes to finding clothes uncomfortable and itchy, and he absolutely loves this sweatshirt. Listeners can get a special discount of 40% if you go to cozyearth.com/Maiden or use the code COZYMMM. That's COZYMMM. Again, 40% off. That's a really good discount. And please, if you're asked in the post-purchase survey, do let them know that you heard about Cozy Earth from this podcast. Transform your home into a sanctuary with Cozy Earth. How do you prevent your kids from being deconverted? What's your school plan, for instance?
Yeah, well, I mean, we've created our own school, the Collins Institute. It's actually it's like the alpha prototype is like totally working now. It's just not fully populated yet in the way we want it populated. But it's really cool. Essentially, we've created like a skill tree that allows them to pursue education as they want to, like however they want to. But this follows our larger thesis around how we're approaching educating our kids, which is, I think, the best weapon against the various progressive cults, like the cults that have sort of formed under the progressive umbrella, is knowledge and truth. I think the fire of truth burns away ignorance. And I think when these groups capture kids, they are able to capture them through wedge issues that the traditional religions have shied away from engaging with honestly. So a topic here might be like sexuality. Sexuality, like, oh, these things arouse you and your parents say that's bad. Like, here's how, like why would they do that? And then they use that to talk to the kids in an area where the parents haven't had conversations with them beforehand. So they can build the kids' entire sexual ideology. And within that encode, you think of it like a like the way hackers work, right? Like you could have an air gapped system, but you forgot about, the dumb employee who picks up a USB stick on the way to work and then plugs it in. Every information gap that your kids have is one of those USB sticks and dumb employees that they can use to deconvert you. But it's not just around sexuality. Like, it's not the only path. I think how the human brain works, psychology, why our religion does what it does. If somebody comes to you and they're like, why does your religion do this? And you don't have a good answer, that's a pathway that they can use to like slide in. And so we try to look for these chinks in our armor and stuff them with knowledge, because I think that that's the best defense.
On this sexuality question, I think that one of the weaknesses that any kind of religious tradition faces now, if it has a prohibition on premarital sex, which Orthodox Christianity with a small o certainly does, lots of basically all religious traditions do, right? I mean, as we know, sort of traditional sexual morality is quite consistent in that respect, is that people have early puberties now. And if the standard within your culture is for people to get married in their mid to late 20s, really at the earliest, and you're having girls starting their periods when they're 12 or 13, whereas traditionally they'd start their periods at 17 or 18, you're asking for a much longer period of sexual frustration. So and the reason girls are starting their periods earlier is kind of for slightly mysterious environmental reasons. Maybe it's to do with weight gain, maybe it's to do with plastics, like we don't know. But the point is, that presents a real problem, and I think that's an important shedding point as well for these traditional religious practices, that kids will then have sexual experiences before they're allowed to within the religion, and then find that they enjoy them and think, oh, I guess that means that the religion is wrong about this or whatever, and they don't realize that second order effects exist because they're teenagers.
Oh, absolutely. And so many religions have co-evolved this sort of backdoor, if we're using hacking references again, in sort of approaches to sexuality. And people are like, why do so many religions have prohibitions against like premarital sex? Well, the answer is because in a historic society that would lead to single mothers. In a historic society, that meant that the community had to support them. If you're talking like traditional Catholicism, they were going to church-run orphanages, or they were on the streets pickpocketing, or they'll say, why do so many religions have co-evolved a prohibition on pornography or gay sex? Well, it's because in every single long-lasting, widespread cultural tradition in the world, whether you're looking in Africa, whether you're looking in Europe, whether you're working in China, has prohibition against gayness, right? And you say, why did this co-evolve in so many traditions? It's because it lowers fertility rates. And so if an iteration of it emerged that did have this, then it would outcompete the other, just from like an evolutionary perspective, like a cultural evolutionary perspective. And so, of course, you're going to get this co-evolved across religious traditions. Now, is it a thing of true morality? This is like a separate question here. But what I would say is the way that we then approach something like sexuality and these sorts of questions is to take the thing that was driving that evolution, having lots of kids. And different religions, evolve different ways to ensure this. You can look at something like some forms of like Judaism, and it's like, you can't have sex while a woman's on her period. Why? Because she's not fertile while she's on her period. And couples who did that ended up having more kids. And, it's a particularly old religion. So it's a religion that developed like really hyper specific systems to maximize fertility. Well, you take the end goal that was the driving evolutionary pressure, maximize the number of kids that you can have and raise well, and then say, okay, focus on that as the moral thing that you're looking at. And then when it comes to, well, then how do you deal with like arousal patterns and tempting kids with arousal patterns? And the way we teach our kids this is we say, look, kids, human beings, have various patterns that differ based on both our genetics and our upbringing, and certain, epigenetic effects that might have happened while you're growing up. But these aren't limited to the things that arouse you. You can also find these in things like foods, like taste. Like, why do we treat taste so different than we treat arousal patterns? It's actually a really interesting question. I mean, taste varies across people. If I say that I raise my kids to not eat cake because I think that eating cake is unhealthy for you, nobody's going to be like, oh, you're cakeophobic, or do you hate everyone who eats cake? Or they might be like, how dare you say that like same-sex attraction, for example, is unhealthy? And I'm like, look, whether or not same-sex attraction is unhealthy now might be beside the point, but when same-sex attraction first started getting widespread societal adoption, that's when the AIDS epidemic broke out. And people who indulge, like genuinely, when that was happening, it's a moral question. Is it worse engaging in what arouses you if it has a risk to your health? And then this becomes it changes depending on the moral framework you've built for yourself. But that's just such an offensive thing to state, even though it's like an obvious thing. But the more that I can help my kids understand the sort of landscape of human arousal patterns, why these patterns might exist in them, and then demystify them, point out that at the end of the day, they're just sort of evolutionary scars, or i.e. things that, may have had some advantage for your distant ancestors. And if they're not evolutionary scars, then they're like random societal things that got programmed into you. Either one of those two, they're not particularly important to your identity. Your identity is the things that you choose for yourself. This sort of way of framing that I don't see within any of the traditional religions.
It's a very rationalist way of framing things. I mean, I guess you're thinking in terms of your children, who are likely to be like you and will have been raised by you, and so it's kind of, I guess, it's not intended to be universalized. It's not intended to be universalized.
Well, it's intended to, like, we've also built systems for how our kids will engage with it when they turn of age. And we use a very different sort of forward thinking approach, which is to say, we lean forwards as a cultural and religious tradition where, because we believe that the core value is intergenerational improvement, we expect our kids to iterate on the culture that we have created for them and attempt to improve it, where the metric that judges whether or not they improved it is their own children. So they are judged by their own children in the same way that we are judged. Like when they're making a change to their tradition, they're not making the change asking, will this make my life easier, but will it increase my children's, total quality of life throughout their life. And we built like reward systems that allow this to work. It's sort of in the same way that, like, within capitalism, we weaponize greed to increase human productivity. Within this system, what we're attempting to do is weaponize childhood rebellion against the parents' cultural traditions and childhood arrogance to force them to stay within the tradition but compete against it through modifications, and the combining of this culture with whatever culture they're marrying into, whereas they're taking the parts of that culture that are in the best interest of the kids, and then their spouse has to argue with them, no, I want to keep a tradition that's not necessarily in the best interest of our kids. If they're arguing for anything outside of, no, I'm choosing to keep these cultural elements because it's in the best interest of the kids. But anyway, yeah.
I'm still preoccupied with this question of, so we know at the moment that the people who are having the most kids are people from super religious and conservative and xenophobic subgroups, which is and technophobic subgroups. The main concern I think that you have and that I have with those groups is their xenophobia and their technophobia, which are good for retaining adherents, but are bad for promoting human flourishing of various kinds. I mean, like, I assume, for instance, that the Amish, they have a low child mortality rate, but I assume that's because they're cushioned by the wider culture. It's because there's very little infectious disease in the wider culture, and so they kind of get away with it. But if we had a 80% Amish America or something, we'd basically return to 18th century child mortality rates, which no one wants. So, but wouldn't the ideal outcome, in a way, be having some outgrowth from those kind of fertile religions, which is technophilic and not xenophobic?
Yes, and I agree with you, and that is why we have worked so hard to build our system into the Judeo-Christian religious tree.
Okay, so you're seeing it more as a Judeo-Christian sect.
Yeah, I'm seeing it more as a continuation of many of the religious experiments that are indicative of American Calvinism. If you read like Puritan spotting, this is something that's talked about a lot. You saw a lot in early American history among our founding fathers and stuff like that, of ways to harmonize religion and science. And I think that I just see this as an iterative mark on that. But I want to talk about something here that you touched on because it's really important. We wrote a piece broadly on this for Aporia, and love the magazine, by the way. in it, our most common pushback, especially from people who went with the traditional religious systems or were taking technophobic paths, because there is one group, I guess I'd call them like the naturalists or whatever, that are not particularly xenophobic. They are not particularly economically unproductive, but they have approached technophobia as the core way to increase their fertility, because it does work. And they're like, why would you not adopt that? Like, why is, or they'll say like, why is industry so important to you? Why is science so important to you? It's not that those things are important in and of themselves for me. It's that you do not have cultural autonomy if you have neighboring populations that are more economically productive or more scientifically productive than your group. The Amish are only Amish at the whim of the United States. If the United States decided they weren't allowed to be Amish anymore, there wouldn't be any Amish in one generation. And so this is one of these things, right? It I have to like when I'm looking to my kids, if I put them down a pathway that allows them to be easily stamped out by anyone with better tech, anyone with better industry, that terrifies me, because those groups, suppose somebody else tries to invent a religion, like whoever else out there, right, tries to invent something, and they do successfully do what we're trying to do, which is to meld high fertility with technophilia. Well, then they can come and they can stomp out my descendants with some religion that may have a moral framework that is quite repugnant to me. And I see at least two of these definitely coming to exist in the near future, because somebody can be like, well, just no one's going to do that. And I'm like, no, definitely someone is going to do that. So one of them is going to come out of an authoritarian country. Could be China, could be somewhere else. It's likely going to involve forced insemination. It's going to be gruesome and scary. And I suspect we'll see this one within our lifetime. The second, I think we're going to see within our children's lifetime, which is as soon as because if you look within countries and between countries, the core population that's not breeding is the economically productive population, which is the core population that companies want. Well, when companies begin to realize and accept that there really are different, like humans, because you see this like dropping IQ potentially due to genetic reasons in the general population right now. When we begin to enter an actual idiocracy, some companies are going to say, okay, we need to start breeding our own people now. And then you're going to have corporate created humans. And these humans, to keep them from leaving the corporation, will likely be bred to be incredibly smart, but also with specific, probably like protein deficiencies and stuff like that. So they need to buy something from the company to stay alive. And so in both of these cases, I do not want a group like that having dominion over my family. Like, it is a race, I think, for whoever in the world right now, and not just my family. Like, I'd prefer to be in an alliance of other technophilic groups, but to create an alliance of technophilic and pluralistic groups that's core, like, overriding, combining value system. And some of these can be tweaks on older religious systems. Most of them, I suspect, will be, is that they believe pluralism is a thing of intrinsic value. And by that, what I mean is they never think that they have the right to attempt to deconvert somebody else's kids or erase another cultural group. As the dominant culture in our society right now clearly believes it has that right, mostly because it's the only way it can replicate. I mean, if you look at this progressive group, they have almost no kids, and people are like, why do they target children? Like, it's weird. Like, it's kind of weird, right? Like, it's perverse. Like, you think that they would know not to target 11-year-olds, right? Well, it's because the time when somebody deconverts from their family's birth culture is between the ages of 15 to 21. That's the window they have. And it hasn't been intentional. It's just that the iterations of this progressive sort of evolved religious system that happen to target kids more aggressively between 15 and 21 ended up outcompeting the iterations that didn't. And so it's become an increasingly more aggressive part of the cultural system. But it's a really dangerous part for them, because they've caught the proverbial lion by the tail. I mean, the more they do this, the more angry the more demographically healthy cultural groups in their vicinity get. But they can't let go, because then they wouldn't have any voters. And then they would disappear as an economically meaningful group. And as soon as that happens, as soon as they begin to lose this war, the lion that they've been holding by the tail is pissed.
Has there ever been, though, a really successful group that's been that pluralistic? Is that not a quirk of the progressive mind virus as you describe it? Or, well, I mean, it's obviously not actually pluralistic, but it rhetorically appeals to tolerance and diversity without actually permitting it. But I
Yes,
mean, but
yes, there
surely
has been.
okay, go ahead. Give me the example.
So there's two core examples, and
Mm-hmm.
and actually, it's something that you typically find with any non-totalizing religious community. So I'll explain what I mean by this. You could divide religions into totalizing religious communities and non-totalizing religious communities. Totalizing religious communities actually sound really nice on paper. They believe that anyone can be saved, anyone can get into their heaven, and this has a downside, which also means that anyone around them that is not following their religious rules must eventually be converted. This is an end result of this belief system. Non-totalizing religious systems believe either in an elect, that there's a set of people who are set aside before birth to be among those who are chosen, or in a genetic or cultural like birth through line. So a great example of this would be Jews. Jews are not a totalizing religion. They can live very easily along other religious traditions without attempting to convert them to Jews. Another great example of this that created America. If you look, there's a Heritage Report study on this. It was something like 70% of at least white America around the time of founding was Calvinist. And the Calvinist tradition believes in the elect. And this belief meant, this is why we have separation of church and state. If you look at modern American evangelicals, if they had been the form of Christianity common when America was being set up, we wouldn't have separation of church and state. If the Catholics had been the predominant religious group, we wouldn't have separation of church and state because both of them believe everyone can be saved. Whereas the Calvinist cultural group doesn't believe that everyone can be saved. So they don't particularly care that much about the people who just happen to be a different religion and are around them. The focus on improvement is much more focused on your children and internally.
I have another question related to this, the long-term strategy here. Would it not also be easier I know that you and Simone have used polygenic screening to conceive your children. I had Jonathan Anomaly on a little while ago talking about polygenic screening. So anyone who's not familiar with the technology could go back and listen to that episode. But in short, you receive reports on each of the embryos that you might implant, giving very comprehensive information on their genetic, the likelihood of them having certain traits, and then you choose on that basis, yada yada. Presumably, it would be possible to we might not have the technology now, but it would be possible to select religious and broody embryos, right? And to basically genetically tailor people who are going to be minded to be fertile in the future. If that's your goal, would that not be a more effective and straightforward way of doing so?
Yeah, I think that some iterations of my descendants will build cultural practices around the use of technology in that way. Whether these groups end up being outcompeted by other groups, I mean, I think that that's how God acts in our world. This is how we've built our religious system, which is to say that, God shows his favor to certain groups, and through that, they end up outcompeting other groups, and they end up so that's why, for example, I would say, the Abrahamic faiths are clearly the correct faith system because God allowed them to be as successful as they are. I mean, if we don't live in a world where something like the Abrahamic faith is true and there is a God, that God messed up big time. It's something that I expect some groups of my kids to attempt and to build cultures around. I don't know if it is the right choice, but time or God or however you want to say it, I think we'll sort that out.
Okay.
Well, I mean, do you see that as an intrinsically negative thing, or
No.
what's the?
I am more, as I think I'm negative about some kinds of reproductive technology. I'm not negative about all kinds of reproductive technology. I think polygenic screening for the purposes of improving the health of the embryo is good, and I'm more minded to agree with Christian denominations that think that life begins at fertilization.
Yeah.
So,
Well, I mean, I can,
implantation, I should say, which means
an
that
implantation. Yeah.
IVF is permissible. I mean, IVF is tricky within the Christian framework, but the arguments for polygenic screening in terms of preventing disease and suffering are very strong. Whether or not I would want to tailor make my descendants to make them more broody, I don't know, because I mean I worry with all of this stuff that we're it's just impossibly hubristic and will be punished one way or another. I suppose that's my
Well,
kind of Old
potentially,
Testament instincts.
potentially, but I mean, a lot of Christians felt that about blood transfusions, and
Yes.
now we see that as normal. A lot of
Well,
Christians thought that
Jehovah's
about IVF to
Witnesses were
be.
slightly vindicated by AIDS crisis, weren't they, on that
Well,
front?
yes, they were. So they had some, but I assume they probably have a higher death rate overall, and they lost,
Probably.
on the whole, probably. But what I wanted to elevate here, um, was the belief that life begins at conception, which I think is going to be, if we're talking about like the religious traditions that I think are going to be the first to die out. If you look at existing studies right now, I don't know if you've had the raw egg nationalists on your show, but if you look at some of his research and like some of the research that's gone out there, it looks like 50% of men in the developed world are going to be sterile by 2060. IVF, due to factors that most religious communities don't have control over anymore. I mean, you go to mountains in the middle of nowhere and they have about the same amount of like microplastics as you find in major cities now, are going to need some form of technology to reproduce. And hopefully we can get past this as a species. Hopefully we can get to a point where, the majority of humans can naturally reproduce again. But I think that's like we are moving too quickly on the pollution side to get there in time to save most of the communities that do believe that life begins at conception. Fortunately, in a historic perspective, this is an incredibly rare system, really only had in Catholics post Pius IX. If you look at the greatest Catholic theologians, Thomas Aquinas, Augustus of Hippo, they believe that life only began insolination, they called it, only began 30 days after the embryo began developing. And so it's a really modern belief. It began to catch on in evangelical circles only really because the American Republican Party. Okay, so this is something I might go into this a little bit. So in the 1970s, a lot of people don't know this, but the Republicans were the pro-choice party. The majority of Republicans in the caucus were pro-choice. They were more pro-choice than the Democrats, but they decided to switch on this topic to try to capture the Catholic vote. And it makes sense that Republicans would be pro-choice. It's about individual cultural sovereignty, which has always been the Republican stance, and it worked. They captured the Catholics, but then a bunch of Republicans forgot that this was like only about capturing Catholics, and they began to compete in these internal status hierarchies where like the more pro-choice you were, the more Republican you are. And then they began to incorporate it into Protestant systems, which it just wasn't historically. Which anyway, sorry. It's a weird thing that now I see like people in the UK who are like Protestant descendants, like I believe life begins at conception, and I'm like, to fight in like a US like cultural battle, why do you believe this? This is not your historic belief system. But a lot of people don't know the history around this, so yeah.
The episode is not over. There is another maybe 30 minutes of content, but it is behind a paywall. If you would like access to that content, if you would like to show support for the show, paid subscriptions are what keep it on the road. Allow me to pay my producers, put food on the table, all that important stuff. The extended version of the podcast is available at my Substack, louiseperry.substack.com. That's where you can also find, as I say every week, bonus episodes, extended episodes, the MMM chat community, all of this. Please sign up for a paid subscription. It makes such an enormous difference to my ability to keep producing the podcast and grow it even bigger, produce more episodes, all that good stuff. There are other ways that you can show your support for the show as well. You can rate and review us on Apple Podcasts. You can like us on YouTube. You can tell your friends and family how much you like the show. If you find it valuable, all of these things make an enormous difference to our ability to keep making it. Thank you so much.